He only had 3 teeth, a limp, and a smell that could knock out a trucker. And I knew he was mine the second I saw him. That's how I introduced Harold to everyone. And yeah, I named him Harold. Because you look at a 14-year-old mutt with cloudy eyes and a grizzled snout and tell me he doesn't look like a Harold. It started on a regular Saturday morning, the kind where nothing is supposed to happen. I'd just finished my coffee and toast when I passed by the Pine Brook Animal Shelter on my way to the hardware store. The sign out front read, "Senior dogs need homes too." Something about that stopped me. Maybe it was the way the sun hit that old wooden sign. Maybe it was how quiet my house had felt lately. Either way, my feet turned before my brain did, and I found myself walking through the front door. A bell jingled above me, and the woman at the desk looked up from her paperwork. She had a face that reminded me of my 3rd grade teacher. Kind, no nonsense, with a short haircut and round glasses. "Can I help you?" I hesitated. "I'm just looking, maybe." She gave me a knowing smile. They all need someone, even the old ones, especially the old ones. I didn't say anything, just nodded. She led me back to a row of kennels. Young dogs barked and jumped at the gates, eager and wild. But at the far end, in the quiet corner, one dog was lying down, head resting on his paws. He didn't even lift his head when we approached. "That's Harold," she said. "He came in 3 months ago, picked up near the riverbank. No microchip, no collar. Vet says he's about 14. Bad hips, nearly blind, and doesn't hear too well." I knelt down in front of the kennel. He finally looked up at me. One eye was clouded, the other a soft amber. Something in the way he looked at me hit harder than I expected. "No one's been interested?" I asked. "Not a soul." I didn't need more than that. 2 hours later, we were in my truck. He sat on the blanket-covered passenger seat like he'd always belonged there, staring straight ahead with that same unblinking calm. We didn't speak, of course, but something settled between us, a sort of agreement. My house was small, just me and a lot of quiet. I'd been on my own since my wife passed away 4 years ago. No kids. I had nieces and nephews in different states, but they were all busy living their own lives. I kept the place tidy, worked part-time at the hardware store downtown, and spent my evenings listening to old vinyl records or watching baseball. That first night with Harold, I made him scrambled eggs and rice. He took forever to eat, but he finished every bite. Then he curled up on the old plaid cushion I put by the fireplace and fell asleep with a sigh. The next morning, I woke up to find him sitting by the door, tail thumping once every few seconds. I grabbed his leash, and we went for a slow walk around the block. Neighbors looked at us like we were some sort of odd couple. Maybe we were, a gray-bearded man and an even grayer dog, both moving a little slower than they used to. I got used to the little things. How he needed help getting into the truck. How he didn't respond to loud noises but perked up when I sat beside him on the rug. How he liked to sleep next to the laundry basket like it was a nest. He had a snore that could shake the windows, and he insisted on licking the couch cushions before settling in. Every week, we developed a rhythm. Mornings were slow walks and boiled chicken. Afternoons were spent with him snoozing while I puttered in the shed. Evenings meant him dragging his blanket over to the couch and collapsing like it was the end of a long workday. 3 weeks in, I noticed something odd. Harold, who barely moved without a grunt, started following me from room to room. First the kitchen, then the hallway. Then he sat beside me while I washed dishes. He didn't demand attention. He just showed up. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Tuesday. I remember because the mailman always came late on Tuesdays. I was out back fixing a squeaky gate hinge when I heard Harold bark. Not a yip, not a growl, a full-on chesty bark that stopped me cold. He hadn't made a sound the entire time I'd had him. I rushed around to the front and saw him at the gate, barking at a man I didn't recognize. The guy looked surprised, even took a step back. "Easy there," I called, walking up. "Didn't mean to startle anyone," the man said, holding up his hands. "I'm with the city doing tree inspections. Saw the dog and thought he looked a bit intense." I looked at Harold. His tail was wagging now, bark done, eyes locked on me like he'd just done something worth a medal. That night, I told him he was a good boy about 20 times. Gave him a little extra chicken, too. He leaned against my leg and sighed like he knew exactly what he'd done. The next few days brought more surprises. He started barking at squirrels, tried to chase a raccoon, though his legs gave out halfway across the yard. He even growled at a plastic bag blowing across the street. Like he was waking up from a long nap he didn't know he was in. The local vet, Dr. Shepard, told me at our next checkup, "Sometimes old dogs get a second wind when they feel safe." "You mean like a last hurrah?" She smiled. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just the first real hurrah he's ever had." That stuck with me. Maybe Harold had never been someone's dog. Maybe this was all new for him. Warm beds, full meals, gentle words. Maybe he was learning what life could actually feel like. The big shock came about 2 months in. It was early morning. I'd just let Harold out when I heard a knock at the door. A young man, maybe mid-20s, stood there holding a small box. "You own the dog that was picked up near the riverbank last winter?" My stomach did a weird flip. "Yeah, I do. Why?" He looked awkward. "My grandfather had a dog named Boomer. Looked just like yours. Same limp, same ears. He went missing the day after Grandpa passed away. We searched for weeks. Never found him." I glanced out at Harold, now sniffing around the grass. "We just wanted to say thank you. If that's him, well, it means he was loved at the end. That matters." He handed me the box. Inside was an old photograph of an older man sitting on a porch with what looked exactly like Harold at his feet. There was a collar, too. Leather, worn, with the name Boomer faintly stamped into the side. I didn't know what to say, just nodded and closed the door gently. I sat on the porch that day, Harold at my feet, staring out at the horizon. Maybe he really was Boomer. Maybe he wasn't. But he was Harold now, my dog, my friend. That night, I placed the old collar on a shelf above the fireplace. Harold didn't seem to notice. He just climbed onto his cushion, circled 3 times, and fell asleep like he always did. And somewhere in that quiet room, I swear, I heard a sigh of contentment. Might have been his, might have been mine. It was around the end of April when Harold started doing something that made me question everything I thought I knew about old dogs. I walked into the living room one evening after putting the dishes away, and there he was, standing on his hind legs, pawing gently at the record player. It wasn't just that he was standing. It was the way he looked over at me, expectantly, as if waiting for a song. "You want music, Harold?" I chuckled, walking over. "Is that what this is?" He sat back down, tail thumping once, so I dropped the needle on an old jazz record. The saxophone filled the room, smooth and slow, and Harold settled in, eyes drifting shut. From then on, every evening became our listening hour. He'd curl up close to the speaker, like he was absorbing each note. It became part of our rhythm. The local kids started calling him the jazz dog. Word got around that there was an old dog who sat and listened to records like some kind of music critic. Kids from the neighborhood would ride their bikes past our front yard and wave, calling out, "Hey, Harold, play something good." Some of them even started bringing him little drawings, crayon doodles of Harold in sunglasses or sitting at a piano. One girl, maybe 9 years old, dropped off a handmade card that said, "Thank you for letting Harold listen to music. My grandma says music makes your heart younger." I pinned that one to the fridge. It wasn't just the kids. Grown-ups began noticing too. People I'd only ever nodded to at the grocery store started stopping to ask how Harold was doing. It was like his story, or maybe just his face, had quietly woven itself into the town. A man from the post office told me, "Seeing that dog on your porch every morning gives me something steady to look forward to." Harold became more than a dog. He became something people counted on. And then, of course, came the fire station incident. It happened on a Thursday morning, sunny and cool. I was walking Harold down Maple Street, just past the old firehouse, when a loud horn blasted from a passing truck. I jumped. Harold didn't. He just kept plodding along like the sound didn't exist. But then I saw him freeze. His nose twitched. He turned his head toward the firehouse and tugged on the leash. Now Harold never tugged. He barely even pulled. But there he was, trying to head toward the open garage doors. "You okay, buddy?" I asked. But he was already moving. I followed. Inside, 2 firefighters were lifting a large crate onto a table. One looked up and grinned. "Hey, it's Harold. We've heard about you. Come to help out?" I laughed, but Harold walked right past me, straight to the crate. He sniffed around it, then barked 3 sharp, quick sounds. The younger firefighter looked startled. "That's weird," he said. "We were just checking this crate because something smelled off." Harold barked again. The man opened the crate's lid. Inside was a box of old rags soaked in what looked like oil. He frowned. "Could have been a hazard. Didn't even notice." Harold sat back down, satisfied. From that day on, the firemen kept a bowl with his name on it near their door. Every time we passed by, they'd bring out a biscuit and scratch behind his ears. That summer, I started noticing something else. Harold seemed more aware. He was still slow, still slept a lot, but there was something sharper in his gaze. One evening, I caught him staring at the record player again, waiting. I switched on the usual jazz, but halfway through the second track, he stood up and walked to the window. I walked over, curious, and looked out. Nothing. Just the street, quiet and gold under the sunset. But Harold was watching something, or maybe waiting. That night, I dreamed of a younger Harold. In my sleep, he was running through fields I didn't recognize, chasing birds, barking at the sky. When I woke up, he was lying next to my bed, snoring gently. Then came the day I took him to the lake. It had been years since I'd been to Misty Pines Lake, but something told me Harold might enjoy it. We packed up early one morning. Well, I packed. Harold supervised from his spot by the door. I tossed in a blanket, some water, his leash, and a peanut butter sandwich for me. When we got there, Harold took in the air like it was the first deep breath he'd had in weeks. I led him down to the shore, and he walked straight to the edge, sniffing the water. Then, to my absolute shock, he waded in. Not far, just enough to get his paws wet, but his tail wagged like it hadn't in weeks. We sat there for hours. I read a book while Harold lay next to me, every so often lifting his head to sniff the breeze or watch a duck float by. A family nearby had brought their dog, a young golden retriever, who kept trying to get Harold to play. At first, Harold ignored him. Then, just once, he stood, gave a small bark, and did a little prance. Just one. Like he remembered the idea of play. I clapped. The family clapped. The young dog barked happily. and zoomed in circles. Harold sat down and let out a breath like he was humoring all of us. The drive home was quiet. He fell asleep in the passenger seat with his head resting against the door. I reached over and rubbed behind his ears. "You're full of surprises, old man." That week, I got a letter in the mail. It was from the shelter I adopted Harold from. A fundraiser was coming up, and they were asking for volunteers, but at the bottom was a handwritten note from the woman at the front desk. "If Harold is up for it, we'd love for him to come. He's become a bit of a legend around here." I showed him the letter. He sniffed it and sneezed. The day of the fundraiser, we arrived early. I brought a little sign I'd made that said, "Meet Harold, 14 years young." Kids gathered around him. He lay patiently as they pet him, drew pictures of him in sidewalk chalk, and asked me questions. One boy, maybe 5, sat next to him and whispered something. I didn't catch it, but Harold licked his cheek, and the boy giggled. The boy's mother came over, touched my arm, and said, "He doesn't usually talk to strangers," but he said Harold told him a secret. That night, when we got home, Harold was tired. He slept harder than usual. But when I tucked the blanket around him, he opened one eye and gave me a look that felt like thanks. Not just for the day, for everything. Around late August, the phone rang one afternoon. It was from a teacher at the local elementary school. "I know this is a bit odd," she said, "but we're doing a kindness project, and one of our students suggested we invite Harold to visit the class. Would you consider bringing him in?" I laughed. "You want Harold to be a guest speaker?" "Sort of," she said, "more like a guest of honor." So 2 days later, I put his collar on, brushed him best I could, and we headed to school. The kids had drawn welcome posters. One read, "Harold for President." Another said, "Old dogs are cool." They gave him treats, took turns reading him stories. One girl held up a drawing of Harold wearing a superhero cape. "What's his power?" I asked. "He makes sad people feel not sad," she said. We stayed for over an hour. Harold didn't flinch once. He let them hug him, sit beside him, feed him bits of apple. On the way out, a little boy ran after me. "Mister, wait! Can I give you something for Harold?" He handed me a plastic army man. "It's for protection, in case monsters come." I thanked him, and that night I placed the little green soldier next to Harold's water bowl. The seasons shifted. Leaves turned. Mornings got chillier. Harold slowed down, but his eyes still lit up when I turned on music, or when kids rode past the house and called his name. I started writing about him. Not on a blog or social media, just in a notebook. Little stories. Harold at the firehouse, Harold and Jazz, Harold meeting the class. Each memory felt like a pearl on a string, something delicate and worth saving. One evening I caught myself staring at him for too long. He was asleep, breathing slow. I reached down, touched his paw, and said, "You changed more lives than most people ever will." He didn't stir, just kept dreaming, maybe of that lake, or of the boy who gave him a plastic soldier, maybe even of his old life, wherever that had been. And all I could think about was what might happen next. By the time September gave way to early October, I could feel the change in the air and in Harold. He still greeted me every morning by the door, still thumped his tail when I brought out the leash, but our walks had slowed from slow to downright glacial. He'd stop every few feet to sniff the same tree trunk or patch of sidewalk we'd passed the day before. Sometimes he'd just stand there and stare at something I couldn't see. It didn't bother me. If anything, I found myself grateful for the way he was making me slow down, too. I'd spent so many years rushing from one thing to another, even after retirement. There had always been something to fix, somewhere to be. Now, Harold was teaching me the art of stillness. One morning, we made it only to the edge of the driveway before he sat down and looked up at me. I waited. After a few seconds, I sat beside him on the cold concrete. We watched the leaves swirl around us. He didn't want to go anywhere that day. He just wanted to be. Later that afternoon, I got a phone call from the community center. They were hosting a local photo exhibit and wanted to include a special corner for residents' pets who had become part of the town's story. "Would you be willing to bring Harold for a short photo session?" they asked. I agreed, though I warned them he wasn't quite as spry these days. "He's earned the right to be a little picky," I added. When we arrived at the small studio set up in the corner of the rec room, Harold gave a little groan as I helped him down from the truck. He sniffed around the equipment while the photographer, a gentleman in his 50s named Russell, adjusted his lighting. Russell didn't rush anything. He let Harold come to him, let Harold circle the room, and when Harold finally laid down on a soft cushion near the window, Russell crouched and took 3 photos, quick, quiet, and respectful. A few days later, the photos were ready. One in particular stood out. Harold in profile, the sun catching the grays and whites in his fur, one ear cocked slightly forward like he was listening to something just out of reach. I framed it and put it on the mantel. Around that same time, a letter arrived from the elementary school. One of the teachers had started a writing project called Letters to Heroes. Each student chose someone they considered a hero and wrote them a letter. Harold had received 9. One read, "Dear Harold, I think you're the best dog ever because you are old but still help people smile. I hope when I'm old I can still help people smile too." Another said, "Dear Harold, my dog ran away and I was sad, but then I met you and you made me feel better." I read each one aloud to him. He wagged his tail at the end of every letter. We began receiving small packages, a bag of homemade treats from a woman in town who said she'd never had a dog but felt like Harold was hers too, a little crocheted scarf someone had made in fall colors, a tin of hand-wrapped dog biscuits from the high school culinary club. He wore the scarf one morning during our walk. 3 different people stopped their cars just to comment. "He's a local celebrity now," one man said with a chuckle. "Can't even get coffee without hearing about Harold." I started taking more photos. Not for anyone else, just for me. I didn't want to forget any of it. Not the way he snored during the nightly news, or how he waited by the front door at exactly 6:30 p.m., ready for our post-dinner stroll, no matter how short it was. I caught a shot of him mid-yawn one evening. Tongue flopped sideways, eyes half closed. I labeled it Harold, Executive of Naps. Then, about halfway through the month, something surprising happened. A knock at the door brought a young couple I didn't recognize. They introduced themselves as Trent and Amanda, recently moved in from Missouri. "We've heard all about Harold," Trent said. "Everywhere we go, it's Harold this, Harold that. We figured we had to come meet him in person." Amanda knelt and scratched under Harold's chin. "We lost our dog last winter. Haven't been ready to adopt again, but Harold kind of reminded us what we were missing." We sat on the porch and talked for almost 2 hours. They asked if they could bring their nieces to meet him the following weekend. "He has fans," I said. "I should start charging for appearances." "Too late," Amanda replied. "He's already more famous than the mayor." That same night, I got a call from the local AM radio station. The host, a woman named Leslie, who ran a morning talk segment called Pine Brook Pulse, asked if I'd be willing to bring Harold by the studio. "It'd just be a quick piece. We're doing a story on community joy, and Harold keeps coming up." 2 days later, we were in the studio. Harold sat on a blanket while Leslie asked me questions about his adoption, his routine, his fans. She played a few clips of kids talking about him. "I don't even mind if he barks," one boy said. "That's just Harold saying hi." Before we left, Leslie leaned in and whispered, "He's doing more good than most of us ever get a chance to." Back at home, I started noticing he slept a little deeper each night. He needed more help standing up, and I had to carry him up the porch steps more often than not. But the spirit in him hadn't dimmed. He still perked up when I brought out his leash. Still moved to the jazz corner every evening. Still had enough gusto to bark once at the neighbor's cat. One morning, I sat beside him on the grass in the front yard while he sniffed the wind. I asked, "You happy, old man?" He pressed his nose into my hand. Later that week, I got a message from the shelter. Another event was coming up, and they wanted to create a slideshow of happy endings to encourage senior dog adoptions. They asked if I had any photos or stories to contribute. I ended up sending 37 pictures and a short write-up. Then I sat at my kitchen table and typed for 3 hours. I wrote about the first time I saw Harold, the way he looked at me through the kennel bars. I wrote about the record player, the classroom visit, the lake, about the scarf, the letters, the slow walks. I called it "The Dog Who Reminded a Town How to Love." The event was a success. 3 senior dogs were adopted that very afternoon. One family approached me as we were leaving. "We weren't planning on getting a dog," the woman said. "But my daughter saw Harold in the slideshow and said, 'Let's find someone who needs us.'" They chose a 12-year-old beagle mix with a gray muzzle and sad eyes. Named him Poppy. Harold sniffed her outside the event hall. She gave his face one slow lick. As we walked back to the truck, I looked at him and said, "You're a matchmaker now too?" He didn't respond, but his tail gave one little wave. The first snow came early that year. Just a dusting, but enough to turn the town white for a day. I opened the door that morning and let Harold step out onto the porch. He sniffed the cold air, then stepped down gingerly onto the path. He walked in slow circles, paused, and then, without warning, he rolled. Right there in the snow. Back and forth, legs in the air, grumbling and snorting. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. Afterward, I helped him back inside, dried him off with an old towel. He seemed content, like he'd gotten something out of his system. That night, he slept beside my chair, as I read by the fire. The room was quiet, except for the occasional crackle and his breathing. I reached down, rubbed the top of his head, and whispered, "We're not done yet, buddy." And I meant it. A few days after the snowfall, I noticed Harold had taken a liking to sleeping in the front room by the bay window. He used to prefer the spot by the fireplace, curled up in his old plaid cushion, but now he sat where he could see the street. He'd lie there for hours, head on his paws, eyes half open, like he was waiting for something. At first, I worried he might be in pain, but every time I approached, he'd blink up at me, thump his tail softly, and go right back to staring outside. So, I let him be. I started leaving the blinds open even after sunset, just in case he liked watching the porch lights flicker on across the street. On a whim, I brought home a little bench from the flea market, cleaned it up, placed it next to Harold's spot, so I could sit with him some evenings. We didn't do much, just sat. Sometimes I'd read aloud. Sometimes we listened to the crickets. Once in a while, a neighbor would wave from across the street and call out, "Evening, Harold!" He never barked, just blinked like a sleepy king on his throne. The whole town knew him by now. He had become part of Pine Brook's personality. When the local diner released a fall menu, one of the new dishes was called Harold's Hotcakes. oatmeal pancakes with sweet apple butter. The owner said she'd seen me walking him past her window so many times she felt like he deserved a dish. I ordered them once. Delicious. One weekend, I took Harold out to visit my old friend Jake on the outskirts of town. Jake had a small apple orchard and 2 friendly goats named Betsy and Norman. I hadn't brought Harold there before, mostly because I wasn't sure how he'd do with livestock. But Jake insisted. Harold stepped out of the truck slowly, sniffed the chilly fall air, and immediately wandered toward the goats. I held my breath. But to my surprise, all 3 stopped about 2 feet from each other and just stared. Then Norman sneezed. Harold gave a startled yip, his version of a surprised shout, and took 2 steps back. Betsy trotted forward and bumped her nose against his shoulder. Harold stood there, blinking, and then gave a very slow tail wag. "Well, I'll be," Jake said, hands on his hips. "Didn't think I'd see the day my goats made a new friend." We spent a couple of hours walking the orchard. Harold sniffed every fallen apple he came across, then lay down in the sun while Jake and I drank coffee. He didn't try to chase the goats or bark at them. He just watched. He seemed to like being part of the background. On the way home, I noticed he was more tired than usual. He didn't lift his head during the drive like he normally did. When we got home, I carried him inside, set him down on his cushion, and sat with him. His breathing was steady, but slower. I stayed beside him well into the night. By morning, he was back to his usual self, ate a little breakfast, wandered to the window, and resumed his post. In mid-November, I got a call from the local news station. They were doing a Thanksgiving piece on community kindness and wanted to include Harold. It would be a short feature, filmed mostly in the front yard, with a reporter doing a quick sit-down interview. We agreed on a Saturday. The crew arrived around 10 in the morning. Harold wore his fall scarf and sat on the bench beside me, calm as ever. The reporter, a young man named Rob, crouched down and gave Harold a gentle pat. "He's even more handsome in person," Rob said with a grin. The questions were easy. About our story, what life had been like since adopting him, how the community had embraced him. I told them about the school visit, the scarf, the hot cakes. Rob asked me why I thought Harold had become so beloved. I paused. "Because he's proof that you don't have to be young or fast or flashy to matter. You just have to be kind. Harold reminds people that there's still something quiet and steady in the world." Harold looked at me then, head tilted like he understood every word. The segment aired the following week. They showed footage of Harold dozing under the maple tree, shots of kids drawing on the sidewalk near his cushion, and even a clip from the fire station. By the next day, people were dropping by to leave notes. One card read, "Thank you for sharing Harold with us." Another simply said, "He makes my day better." I kept them all in a shoebox near the door. Winter crept in. Mornings were colder, and I bought Harold a small space heater for his window corner. I wrapped his cushion in a warm fleece blanket. He took to it immediately, curling up with a little grunt each time. One icy morning, I bundled us both up and we went out into the yard. The ground was frozen, the air sharp. Harold walked a slow lap around the garden beds, then stood still near the bird feeder. I watched him watching them. He stood for nearly 5 minutes, unmoving. When a blue jay flew close, he twitched his ears. That evening, I played one of the jazz records. He didn't move to the speaker like he used to. Stayed curled up, eyes closed. I sat beside him and lowered the volume. After a moment, he opened one eye, nudged his nose into my hand, then went back to sleep. Around the second week of December, I got a call from the mayor's office. They were hosting the town's holiday celebration in the main square and wanted to recognize Harold. They planned to dedicate a small bench in the park, something with his name on it. "Nothing big," the woman said. "Just a little plaque for everything he's done." The ceremony was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon. Snow had fallen the night before, just enough to blanket the sidewalks. I wrapped Harold in his thickest scarf and carried him to the truck. He lay across the seat, snoring quietly until we pulled up. The mayor made a short speech. Talked about how sometimes the smallest, quietest presences in a community end up making the biggest difference. Then they pulled the cover off the bench. It was simple. Wooden slats, curved backrest. The plaque read, "Harold's Spot for reminding us that kindness never grows old." The crowd clapped. Someone started a round of applause just for Harold. I set him down in front of the bench and knelt beside him. He blinked at the sign, sniffed the snow, and wagged his tail once. That night, after I'd tucked him into his cushion, I sat in the chair beside him with a cup of cocoa. Outside, the wind blew gently. Inside, it was quiet and warm. I looked down at him and said, "They built you a bench, old man." He let out a small breath, content. Christmas came, and so did more visitors. Carolers stopped by and sang a song just for Harold. Kids brought handmade ornaments with his face drawn in glitter. One family dropped off a small tree decorated with paw-shaped cutouts that read things like friend, joy, and peace. I put the tree near his spot. One evening, I caught myself humming while washing dishes. I glanced over and saw Harold watching me. His head was resting on his paws, eyes soft. "I think we make a good team," I told him. He didn't respond, but he didn't need to. I had a dream later that week, one of those dreams that feel like memories, even though they're not. In it, Harold was young again. His legs worked like springs, his coat was thick and golden brown. He ran through an open field and turned to look back at me, eyes bright, tail high. When I woke up, he was snoring softly in his usual spot. The days passed quietly. Snowstorms came and went. We stayed indoors more often. I spent extra time beside him, read aloud, played old records, wrote more in my notebook. And through it all, Harold remained. Silent, steady, watching. January came in quiet and gray, the way it always did in Pine Brook. Snow fell softly most mornings and melted into slush by midday. Harold still woke with me, still gave one thump of his tail when I set his bowl down, but he spent more time in his cushion than anywhere else. I moved his food and water closer so he didn't have to wander far. He appreciated that, showed it with a slow blink and the gentle nudge of his nose against my hand. One afternoon, I got a call from the town library. They were hosting a winter reading series and invited me to read some of my short stories aloud to a small group of visitors. When I hesitated, the librarian laughed and said, "People don't want to hear from you. They want to hear about Harold." So I agreed. I picked out a few favorites: his first trip to the lake, the firehouse day, the scarf, the bench dedication. On the day of the reading, I brought a framed photo of Harold to set beside me. He couldn't make the trip, not in this weather, but I felt like he should still be part of it. The room was full: adults, teenagers, even a few younger kids with notepads in their laps. I read each story slowly, pausing when people laughed or sniffled. When I finished, someone raised a hand and asked, "Do you think Harold knows he's changed so many lives?" I answered honestly, "I don't think Harold knows he's special. I think he just knows he's loved, and that's probably enough. Afterward, several folks came up to shake my hand. One woman hugged me. Another gave me a crocheted patch shaped like Harold's face. I tucked it into my coat pocket and smiled all the way home. Back at the house, Harold hadn't moved far from his spot. But when I sat beside him and told him all about it, the people, the laughter, the questions, he tilted his head, then rested it on my foot. That was all he had to say. That night, I dug out an old box from the attic. Inside were frames I'd never hung and some sketchbooks from years ago. I hadn't drawn since before my wife passed. The urge just hadn't been there. But Harold had a way of pulling old parts of me back into the light. I cleared a space on the kitchen table, sharpened a few pencils, and began sketching. I wasn't aiming for anything perfect, just something real. I drew him from memory. Sleeping, walking, that half-lidded stare he gave when the sun hit just right. Hours passed. I didn't stop until the lines looked like him. The next morning, I tacked the drawing above his cushion. He looked up at it, snorted once, and closed his eyes again. A week later, the Pinebrook Middle School invited me to give a short talk for their Kindness in Action Day. The students had voted Harold as their mascot for the month. They made posters that read, "Be like Harold, kind, quiet, loyal." I showed up with a slideshow and my framed photo. I told them about how Harold came into my life, what it meant to care for someone who needed you more than you realized. The kids were quiet during the whole thing. No phones, no whispering. At the end, a boy in the back raised his hand and asked, "Do you think Harold ever had a best friend before you?" The question sat heavy for a moment. "I don't know," I said. "But I like to think that if he didn't, then he was just waiting for the right one." The gym was quiet after that. After the talk, the principal gave me a large envelope full of thank you cards, each one with a drawing of Harold. Some were realistic, some weren't. One showed him in a cape flying over the school. That night, I pinned every single card to the wall near his cushion. He didn't react much, but I caught him watching me do it, one by one, pin by pin. Later that week, I got a call from Amanda, the young woman who had visited with her husband a few months back. She was putting together a town newsletter and wanted to do a feature on people who had helped shape the community. "Would you be willing to talk?" she asked. "About Harold? About what this whole journey has been like?" I said yes. She came by the house on a Saturday morning, brought muffins and coffee, and sat across from me in the kitchen while I talked. Harold stayed curled up, breathing slow. "He seems peaceful," she said. "He is," I told her. "More than I've ever been, I think." She asked questions about the day I adopted him, the first few weeks, the changes I'd noticed over time. I told her about the scarf again, the bench, the plastic soldier that still sat near his water bowl. When she left, she hugged me and whispered, "Thank you for giving him a good life." That afternoon, I took Harold outside. It had warmed just enough for a short walk. I helped him down the steps, and we made it to the sidewalk. We didn't go far. A few feet, then he stopped and stared up at the sky. I followed his gaze. A hawk circled above. I don't know why, but I said out loud, "You ever think about flying, Harold?" He didn't answer, of course, but he blinked slowly, then sat down on the cold ground. I sat beside him. A car passed. The driver waved. I waved back. That evening, a knock at the door surprised me. It was Russell, the photographer who had taken Harold's picture back in the fall. "I was cleaning up my files and found something," he said, holding out an envelope. Inside was a print I hadn't seen before. It was a candid shot of Harold, sitting with one paw slightly raised, head turned toward the window, light catching the soft curve of his muzzle. It was beautiful. "He looked noble," Russell said. "Didn't want to leave it on my hard drive." I framed it that night and placed it above the fireplace. Each day after that, I began writing down little details. His routines, the way he refused to eat unless I was sitting close by, how he barked once at the wind chime when it clanged too loud, how he occasionally dragged his blanket 5 feet across the room for no clear reason. I wrote about how his ears twitched in sleep, how he always seemed to know when I was having a rough day, how he once scared away a deer by just staring at it through the glass. The stories filled 3 notebooks. One morning, I woke up and found him still asleep. Nothing unusual about that, but when I bent down to check on him, I saw his eyes flutter open, slowly, and he gave me the softest little wag. Then he nudged my hand like always. We sat there a while. I didn't bother making coffee yet, just sat on the floor beside him, stroking his back, humming one of those slow jazz melodies we'd listened to all year. Later that day, I received an invitation from the senior center. They were organizing a storytelling evening and wanted me to come share Harold's journey with their members. I hesitated. I wasn't sure Harold could handle another public visit, even one as low-key as this. But then, the idea struck me. I told them I'd attend, but instead of bringing Harold, I'd bring the bench. They laughed when I told them on the phone. "You mean the actual bench?" "Just the sign, Harold's spot. I'll prop it next to me. He'll be there in spirit." So I did. The night of the event, I stood beside the plaque and told story after story. I saw smiles, tears, the whole spectrum. I ended with the line I'd come to believe deep in my bones. You don't have to be strong or young or perfect to leave a mark. Sometimes just being there is enough. Harold taught me that. When I returned home, Harold was sleeping. The heater hummed beside him. I sat on the bench near his cushion, pulled the blanket up around his shoulders, and told him everything. And just before I turned in for the night, I heard it. One small, steady tail thump against the floor. Still listening. Still here. February came in cold, wind howling through Pinebrook like it had a purpose, but the house stayed warm. I kept the heater near Harold's cushion running around the clock now. I didn't mind the electric bill. Whatever made him comfortable was worth every cent. His movements were slower, but not strained. He still greeted me in the morning, still waited by the window in the evening, still had that little spark in his eyes when I walked into the room. But he spent more time asleep than awake these days. I adjusted my schedule to match his rhythm. I woke when he did, sat beside him when he stirred, walked short laps with him on good days, and let him rest on the porch on the not-so-good ones. One afternoon, I received a letter from the County Humane Society. They were starting a new program inspired by Harold, Golden Companions, a matchmaking system for seniors and senior dogs. The letter thanked me and Harold for showing what a second chance could look like. They asked if I'd write a short piece for their newsletter. I took the typewriters down from the attic, cleaned it, oiled it, rolled in a fresh sheet of paper. Then I sat down and typed. Every dog deserves a soft place to land, no matter how old. Harold didn't just land in my home. He landed in my life, and everything changed. When I dropped the letter off at the post office, the clerk smiled as she stamped it. "This one's going somewhere good," she said. Harold and I kept our routine. Mornings were slow. I'd play quiet jazz or soft piano music while we sat in the sunlit front room. Evenings were spent reading stories aloud, sometimes letters, sometimes articles about dogs or kids who built shelters from cardboard and tape and dreams. He listened to everything. I added more drawings to the kitchen wall, sketches of Harold curled up, Harold sniffing a pine cone, Harold looking mildly offended by a gust of wind. They made the room feel warmer. On a Friday morning, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note and a photograph of an elderly woman sitting on a porch, holding a beagle mix in her lap. The note read, "I was afraid to try again after losing my last dog." Then I read about Harold. I went to the shelter the next day. "This is Walter. Thank you." I showed the picture to Harold. He blinked slowly at it, then placed his head gently against my knee. I took that as a good sign. The next week, a high school student named Maddie asked if she could interview me for her senior project. She was writing about small acts of kindness that changed communities. She came by after school one afternoon, notebooks in hand, camera hanging from her shoulder. She asked thoughtful questions about Harold's adoption, what he meant to me, what I thought he meant to others. "Do you think one dog really made all that difference?" she asked. I nodded. It wasn't about being extraordinary. He just showed up. And when you do that long enough, people notice. She smiled and looked down at Harold. He was lying on his side, snoring gently. "Can I take his picture?" "Sure," I said. "Just don't wake him." The camera clicked once, twice. The article came out 2 weeks later. It was titled, "The Dog Who Waited, the Town That Watched." I tacked it to the fridge beside all the drawings and thank you notes. The kitchen was a mosaic of Harold now. Colorful, quiet, comforting. In early March, I noticed Harold had started watching the front door a little more often. He didn't bark, didn't fuss, just stared at it like he expected someone. I checked the mail, asked the neighbors if they were planning visits, but no one knew anything. One afternoon, as I sat beside him, I asked, "Expecting company?" He didn't answer, but his ears twitched slightly. That night, I dreamed again. In the dream, I was sitting on the front porch, and Harold was at the edge of the lawn, tail wagging, ears high. Then he looked back at me and took off running, not away, but forward, like he was chasing something he knew well. The wind lifted around him, and in the dream, I felt no sadness, just peace. When I woke, the house was silent. I found Harold in his usual spot, breathing slow and even. Later that day, the hardware store where I used to work called and asked if I could stop by. The manager said they were putting together a display on loyalty and community care and wanted to include a tribute to Harold. "We've had customers talk about him more than any product we sell," he said, laughing. "Figured we ought to do something." I brought them a framed photo, a copy of one of the stories I'd written, and a sketch of Harold sitting proudly beneath a tree. They built a small display near the entrance. A photo, a quote, and a sign that read, "Loyalty doesn't retire." That week, I started going through old boxes I hadn't opened in years. I found letters from my wife, postcards from family, and even a list of baby names we never got to use. I sat on the floor with the box open, Harold's head resting on my leg, and read them aloud. It felt like introducing him to the people I'd loved before him. A neighbor dropped off a fresh-baked loaf of banana bread the next day. She left a note that read, "Thank you for making kindness visible." I placed the note on the mantel. The days grew warmer. A few crocuses poked up through the soil by the porch. Harold stirred more often during the day, though not for long. He had started sleeping with his nose buried under the edge of his blanket. One Sunday morning, I turned on the radio, and a Louis Armstrong tune came on. Harold lifted his head, blinked slowly, then pushed himself upright, and turned toward the music. "Still got good taste," I said. He wagged his tail once. That afternoon, I brought out his cushion onto the porch. We sat in the sun. Birds chirped from the maple trees. I sipped coffee. Harold rested his chin on his paws and watched the wind dance through the grass. A young couple walked by with their toddler. The little boy pointed at Harold and yelled, "Doggy!" Harold looked up, tail giving a gentle tap. "He's famous," the father said. "Deservedly," I replied. We watched them walk off, the toddler waving until they turned the corner. That evening, I opened a new notebook. On the first page, I wrote, "Harold, Chapter 2. Then I sat back, pencil in hand, and waited. Harold was sleeping beside me, and I had a feeling there were still more stories to come. By mid-March, the days had stretched just enough to let the sunlight linger a little longer in Harold's favorite room. That front corner by the window turned gold in the late afternoon, and Harold would lie there, nose twitching, watching the soft sway of the trees outside. Sometimes I caught him dreaming. His legs would twitch, tail fluttering ever so slightly. I wondered what scenes played behind those half-closed eyes. Meadows, maybe, or a memory from long ago before we met. The town was already preparing for the annual spring fair. It was still weeks away, but Pinebrook folks liked to get things in order early. One morning, I found a flyer tucked under my door. There was a note scribbled at the bottom. "Would Harold be our guest of honor this year? We can set up a shaded spot, no crowds, just a presence. Let us know." I read the note out loud to Harold. He didn't respond immediately. But later that afternoon, when I brought out his old scarf to freshen it up for spring, he leaned in and licked my wrist. I took that as a yes. As the weather grew gentler, Harold seemed to perk up in his own quiet way. Not with bursts of energy, but with more alertness. He spent more time awake, more time looking around. He began following me from room to room again, not every time, but often enough that I found myself talking to him more regularly, as though he were another voice in the house. "We need eggs," I said one morning. He wagged his tail once. "Maybe we'll bake something. You like banana muffins, don't you?" A blink, a yawn. Then he rested his head on his paws. Even the mailman noticed. "Harold's looking bright today," he said with a nod. "He knows spring is near," I replied. I started working on something new that week. I pulled out a stack of fresh paper, sat at the kitchen table, and began writing a children's book. Tentative title: The Dog Who Waited by the Window. Each page was inspired by something Harold had done, or a moment we had shared. The firehouse visit, the school library reading, his bench in the park. I added sketches in the margins, nothing polished, just pencil and paper. After finishing a draft of the first few pages, I read them aloud to Harold. His tail twitched, and he blinked at me like he approved. Or maybe he was just being polite. Either way, I kept writing. A few days later, Amanda dropped by with her husband. They brought their nieces, just as they'd promised months ago. The girls tiptoed through the house until they reached Harold's cushion. One crouched and whispered, "Is this really him?" I nodded. "This is the famous Harold." They took turns gently petting his back. their small hands careful and soft. Harold lifted his head just slightly, sniffed their fingers, then closed his eyes again, satisfied. Amanda stayed behind after the girls went out to the porch. She looked around the room, taking in the drawings, the cards, the wall of thank you notes. "I hope you know this house feels like a story," she said. "It is," I said. "He wrote it. I just held the pen." Later that week, the town library announced a new event series, Read with Harold. It was simple. Families could come in, pick a book, and read aloud beside Harold's photo and his bench plaque. A local woodworking student had built a replica bench just for the program. The librarian told me that kids who normally refused to read in front of others were lining up for their chance to sit in Harold's spot. "Something about it makes them feel safe," she said. That Sunday, I visited the library myself. The bench sat beneath a sunlit window, surrounded by books about animals, friendship, and hope. I sat down and read one of my own stories, the one about Harold barking for the first time at the city inspector. When I looked up, there were 6 people sitting nearby, listening quietly. Harold wasn't there in person, but in every way that mattered, he was. Back home, I found him lying in a new position. He'd moved his cushion closer to the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, just enough so he could see into both rooms. I bent down and scratched behind his ear. "Keeping an eye on things?" A soft grunt. I added a new habit to our days. Morning notes. Each morning after breakfast, I'd write one short sentence on a piece of paper and place it on the window ledge above his cushion. Things like, "Today will be quiet and good," or "The world is better with you in it." Neighbors started dropping off their own notes, too. By the end of the week, there were over a dozen folded slips sitting on the ledge. Some were typed, some handwritten in blocky letters, all addressed to Harold. One morning, I woke early and found Harold already sitting up. He wasn't looking out the window. He was watching me. Just watching. His eyes were clear, alert. It was rare for him to be up before me these days. I walked over, sat beside him, and we stayed there, side by side, while the light filled the room. A few days later, the mayor sent a small framed certificate in the mail. It read, "To Harold, for distinguished service to the spirit of Pine Brook." I added it to the wall. That same week, the Pine Brook School District announced they were launching a Harold Award for students who displayed exceptional kindness. The first recipient was a 6th grader who had spent every lunch period helping younger students who didn't have many friends. When they presented the award, they played a slideshow of Harold's photos on the screen. Afterward, the student sent a note. "Thank you, Harold. You made me brave." Harold didn't stir much that evening, but he lifted his head when I read the note aloud. As the fair drew closer, more townsfolk stopped by the house. They brought handmade gifts, notes, even small trinkets with Harold's name engraved. Someone left a clay sculpture of him on the porch. Another person gifted a handmade quilt stitched with tiny paw prints. I set the quilt beside his cushion. He tucked his nose under it within minutes. At the next vet visit, Dr. Shepard checked Harold gently, murmuring praise with each careful touch. "He's aging gracefully," she said. "Still got that fire in him. Maybe not in his legs, but it's there." She gave him a clean bill of health, at least for now. We both knew the truth, but neither of us needed to say it. What mattered was that he was content. Back at home, I brewed some tea and settled in by his side. I read another chapter of the children's book aloud. I was halfway through when Harold gave a little sigh and shifted closer. "You like this one?" I asked. He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. That night, I added a new page. It read, "The dog didn't chase squirrels anymore. He didn't need to. He had found something better than running. He had found someone who waited." The next morning, I opened the curtains early. The sky was streaked with orange and pink. I sat on the bench by the window, Harold beside me. We watched the world wake up again. And we waited together, like always. The morning of the spring fair came with a gentle breeze and the smell of fresh-cut grass drifting in from the neighbor's lawn. I was already awake when Harold stirred, his usual slow blink and gentle grunt greeting the day. The sunlight spilled through the curtains and pooled on his cushion. He shifted just enough so his face landed right in the warm patch. I crouched beside him and said, "Big day, huh?" He blinked, then blinked again. Outside, Pinebrook was already coming to life. I could hear the hum of early setup, tables clattering into place, vendors calling instructions, children squealing as they ran across the damp field. I loaded a small bag with Harold's scarf, a couple of his favorite soft treats, and a folded towel to place on the bench they'd prepared for him. I took my time lifting him into the truck. His body sagged a bit more than it used to, and he leaned into my chest like he wanted to stay in my arms a second longer. We drove slowly, windows cracked just enough to let the breeze in. The town square had transformed. Banners fluttered in pastel colors, the smell of funnel cake and kettle corn drifted through the air, and balloons bobbed lazily in clusters tied to lampposts. As I parked near the vendor lot, a small group of children ran up to greet us. "Is that Harold?" one of them gasped. "Can we pet him?" another asked. I smiled. "He's a little sleepy today, but if you sit quietly near the bench, I bet he'll give you a tail wag." The spot they'd prepared for Harold was perfect. A shady nook under a large oak tree, just far enough from the crowds to keep it peaceful. The bench was there, the plaque shining in the early sun, and beside it stood a wooden sign with painted letters that read, "Sit with Harold. Tell him a story." I laid down the towel, gently set Harold onto it, and wrapped his scarf around his neck. He adjusted his position with a low groan and then settled in, front paws crossed, eyes soft but alert. People came in waves. Some brought drawings, others simply sat on the grass nearby and read from picture books or whispered short stories. One boy brought a harmonica and played 3 quiet songs. Harold listened to every one. At one point, a little girl placed a crown of daisies on his head. He didn't budge, just accepted it like a gentleman. Around noon, the mayor stopped by. She crouched beside him and said, "We owe you one, Harold. This town's heart beats a little fuller because of you." She pinned a small ribbon to his scarf, green and gold, labeled Community Hero. The crowd around him stayed respectful. Nobody shouted. Nobody pulled. They sat near him like he was a wise old teacher, which, in some ways, he was. By the afternoon, Harold had drifted off into a deep nap, still breathing evenly, still warm and steady. I sat beside him on the grass, greeting people as they came and went. A few brought notes and left them on the bench. Others just smiled, gave a nod, and kept walking. One woman, clearly emotional, approached and knelt next to me. "My dad died last year," she said. "He was quiet, like Harold, kind and simple. Watching your dog. It feels like seeing a piece of him again. Thank you." I didn't know what to say. I just reached out and took her hand for a second. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the park, I knew it was time to go. I lifted Harold carefully and carried him back to the truck. He gave a small sigh as I set him down on his cushion and tucked the towel around him. We drove home in silence, save for the rustle of trees and the occasional chirp of spring birds. That night, after dinner, I read him the first finished draft of The Dog Who Waited by the Window. It had taken me nearly a month, but I'd written every page from the heart. He didn't move much, but every so often his eyes flicked open, just enough to see me there beside him. When I reached the final page, where the dog watches a sunrise and thinks, "This is home," Harold let out a breath that sounded almost like a sigh of agreement. The next few days were calm. He spent more time sleeping, but there was no discomfort, no signs of pain, just stillness, deep and full. I kept the music soft, the lights warm, the house steady. Friends dropped off notes, drawings, even baked goods they said were inspired by Harold. I shared the treats with neighbors. It felt like the entire town had adopted him by then. I rearranged his cushion one morning so it caught more of the morning light. When I set him down, he gave a small, satisfied grunt and tucked his nose under his front leg. A few minutes later, I saw his tail flick once, twice. The boy with the harmonica came by again that afternoon. He sat on the porch and played 3 more songs. Harold didn't wake up this time, but the boy stayed for a long while anyway. I kept writing, short stories now, little fragments. Titles like Harold and the School Bell, The Dog Who Knew the Mailman's Route, The Day the Goats Said Hello. Every story made me smile. One evening, I took out the quilt and wrapped it around us both as we sat on the porch. The sun was setting, and the sky had that watercolor glow that only spring evenings carry. Harold leaned against my leg, and for a few minutes, everything felt still and right. "Another good day, huh?" I asked. He didn't move, but he didn't need to. A few days later, I got a call from the local elementary school. They were planning a kindness garden and wanted to plant a tree in Harold's name. "A flowering dogwood," the teacher said. We thought it would be fitting. They invited me to the planting ceremony the following week. I told Harold about it that night, sitting on the floor beside him. He opened one eye, shifted slightly, and then went back to sleep. The morning of the ceremony, I gently lifted Harold and brought him to the school. They'd prepared a blanket under a tree near the garden bed. As the kids gathered, the principal read a short speech about kindness, loyalty, and how small acts can ripple through an entire town. One by one, the children placed stones around the base of the sapling, each painted with a word: hope, love, gentle, brave, comfort, listen. The final stone said simply, Harold. The dogwood tree stood straight and slender, its branches already budding. We stayed a while. Then I brought Harold home, laid him gently on his cushion, and sat beside him with a cup of tea. That evening, I found a note tucked into my mailbox. It read, "Some dogs chase balls, some chase tails, yours chased hearts, and caught them all." I added it to the fridge, in the corner closest to Harold's window. The day after the tree planting ceremony, I woke to a gentle hush in the house. Not quiet like silence, but the kind that settles around you like a blanket. The kind that asks you to move slower, speak softer, notice more. I walked past Harold's cushion and saw him still sleeping, nose tucked under the quilt, his head nestled close to the edge of the morning light. His chest rose and fell with calm steadiness. I made coffee, sat by the window, and waited for him to wake like I always did. But that morning, Harold slept longer than usual. I didn't mind. I let him rest. Around mid-morning, I walked into the front room with a letter I'd received from a teacher in Ohio. She'd heard about Harold from a cousin in Pinebrook and wanted to start a Read with Harold bench at her school. I thought he'd like hearing about that. I read the letter aloud beside him, then reached down and rested my hand on his back. It was warm, soft. He didn't stir. I stayed there a long time, just talking. That afternoon, a light rain rolled in. Not heavy, just the kind that taps gently at the roof and windows. I lit a candle on the kitchen table and pulled out my notebook. I began writing a new story, The Dog Who Listened to the Rain. I only got 3 pages in before I felt the need to check on him again. He was still there, still sleeping, but something in me paused. I bent down and whispered, "You want music?" I walked to the record player and put on the first jazz album we'd ever listened to together. As the saxophone drifted through the room, Harold exhaled, long and slow. The sound moved through me like a memory. I sat back on the bench beside him and just watched the rain. We stayed like that for hours. That night, the wind picked up. The maple tree out front rustled its branches like it was trying to remember a song. I turned down the lights, added another layer to his blanket, and rested my hand on his back again. His breathing had changed. Still steady, but quieter. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed beside him. At some point in the early morning, I closed my eyes just for a moment. When I opened them again, the room was still. Completely still. He was peaceful. Curled up just as he'd always been, head slightly tilted toward the window. The sky outside was turning the softest shade of gray-blue. I didn't cry right away. I reached out, smoothed the fur between his ears, and whispered, "Thank you." Word got around quickly. By mid-morning, neighbors had left candles, flowers, and drawings at the base of his favorite window. Someone placed a small tin of peanut butter treats beside the door. The boy with the harmonica returned that afternoon and sat on the porch, playing 3 quiet songs. Then he left, without saying a word. The mayor called to ask if the town could organize a small gathering in the park near Harold's bench. I agreed. The following Sunday, nearly the whole town showed up. Kids brought hand-painted stones to add around the base of the bench. Each one had a single word: kind, home, music, watch, soft. A group of students read aloud the stories I had written. When they got to the one titled "The Dog Who Waited by the Window," I felt something catch in my chest. But it wasn't sadness. Not exactly. It was something warmer. The final reader, a boy no older than 10, looked up after the last line and said, "Thank you, Harold." Everyone clapped, gently, just enough to fill the spring air. I brought his scarf with me and tied it around the arm of the bench. The wind caught the end of it, lifting it slightly before letting it fall. Back home, the house felt different. Not empty, just quieter in a way I couldn't define. I kept the cushion by the window, though I fluffed it and straightened the blanket. I left the notes on the windowsill, added new ones people kept mailing. I still read them aloud. The tree at the elementary school started blooming early. The teacher sent me a photo of the kids sitting beneath it with picture books in their laps. The plaque beneath it read, "Harold's Tree, a place for gentle hearts." A publisher from a small press reached out after reading the stories online. They wanted to turn the collection into a book. I said yes. I called it The Dog Who Stayed. A month later, I found a note in my mailbox with no name. It said, "He may be gone, but every time I see someone do something gentle, I think, Harold's still around." I taped it to the fridge. Spring melted into summer. I still wrote, still sat on the bench outside every evening, listening to the crickets. Sometimes I'd talk aloud, like I was telling Harold about my day. I didn't care if it seemed silly. One late afternoon, I heard a bark, high, sharp, and young. A puppy had wandered into my yard, tail wagging wildly. I crouched and held out my hand. The pup ran straight to me, plopped its front paws on my knee, and looked up like we'd known each other forever. There was no collar. I checked with neighbors, the shelter, even posted a notice online. No one claimed him. I didn't name him for a while, just called him Pup. He followed me room to room, sniffed Harold's cushion, and slept curled beside it. It took me a month to realize what name felt right. I called him Harold Jr. He'll never be the same, and I don't expect him to be. But he reminds me every day that the story isn't over. It just has a new page. And every morning, he sits in the same spot by the window, watching the world go by. Waiting. Just like the dog who taught us all how to stay.